Let's have a look at the English suite and what happened in summer 2019. So starting with GCSE English language, and we'll just have a look at the picture for the 16-year-old cohort. So that way we can compare year on year in a much more reliable way, and we aren't distorting the figures with early entries or with resit students. We've seen entries go up this year by about 23,000. Now, some of that is due to the fact that the 16-year-old cohort is a bit bigger this year, but we've actually seen entries for English language go up by more than we would expect as a result of that. So we think perhaps some of that is more students coming across from the IGCSE, potentially also a bit of a decrease in early entry as well. Now, the outcomes overall for 16-year-olds are very, very stable at a national level in GCSE English language. That's what we would expect to see and what we'd hope to see as a result of the comparable outcomes approach that we use to award the qualifications. But as I say, we've seen those outcomes looking very, very stable for 16-year-olds. And we've also seen the grade boundaries across the piece being very stable as well. And that's great for us to see because that actually suggests a high level of consistency in the assessments and in their demand from year to year. So if we look at post-16 students, now post-16 entries this year are actually pretty stable for English, which suggests probably a levelling off of resits. If we look at the outcomes for those post-16 students, we can see that actually those outcomes have decreased a little bit year on year. So at grade 7, they're stable at 1.2% of students, but at grade 4, we've seen a drop from 32% to 30.5% of 17-year-olds achieving a grade 4 or above in their resit. The final thing to mention in terms of GCSE English language is the National Reference Test, a suite of tests that Ofqual have got a sample of 16-year-olds to sit for the last couple of years that's intended to provide a little bit more independent evidence. So this year was the first year that Ofqual could have chosen to use the National Reference Test data, but actually having looked at the data, they've decided not to do that. There isn't a significant enough movement in that data to use it to influence the GCSE outcomes. Moving on to look at GCSE English literature, and again we'll just look at the figures for 16-year-olds only. And again for literature we've also seen a slight increase in entries among 16-year-olds this year. Again, some of that due to an increase in the size of the cohort, perhaps some due to IGCSE switching, and perhaps also just the impact of the double weighting in performance measures, which is obviously encouraging schools to enter as many students as possible for both English language and literature. Now, we've also seen a slight increase in early entry for literature this year, about 35,000 entries, up from about 30,000 last year. Now that, it's very important to note, means that there hasn't been a widespread move to this. That's still a relatively small proportion of the cohort. Now for those students who are entering early, we've seen the outcomes for those 15-year-olds at grade 4 drop a little bit this year. Now it's hard to be sure of a like-for-like comparison with last year. But what we do know from 2018 is that disadvantaged students are more likely to be entered early for English literature. And when those students have been entered early, typically they've achieved about 1/3 of a grade less than similar students who were entered in year 11 for the qualification. So I'd really suggest bearing those things in mind when you're thinking about your strategies around early entry for your students.